In Unit 10 of the class, we are going to discuss political parties. I think immediately, one of the ways to think about parties is that so many Americans are really unsatisfied with the two-party system. Think about this as a choice of who to vote for in the next presidential election, maybe. Most Americans hate the fact that we only have two choices, and these two choices probably don't represent a person's real concerns or views about government. In addition, most Americans view parties as contributing to the inefficiency of government because the two major parties, Democrats and Republicans, are so far apart from one another on a bunch of different issues. This tends to turn most Americans off of politics. In actuality, most people would actually prefer a system where the parties compromise, but in practice, this rarely happens nowadays. This lecture is going to cover the discontent with political parties in America. Here's the agenda for today, and in part one of the video, I'm going to merely describe political parties. Some of you are probably uncomfortable with discussing the parties because you don't know the difference between them. Some of you might not even decide to choose to register with a party. However, it's pretty easy to discern between both Democrats and Republicans, and it's important because these two parties have huge implications for how American government works. In part two of the class, I'm going to contend with the two-party system, and the idea behind this section is that we're only offered a choice, Democrat and Republican, but why is this? This part of the lecture is going to try to unpack the logic of why we only have two choices and third parties tend to be ruled out of American politics. And in the last part of the class, I'm going to trace the beginnings of what's called party polarization. Polarization is the idea that the two parties are becoming more extreme versions of one another. And in this section, I'm going to suggest to you that this is done by design, that there are people in this country, elites, who have been benefiting from encouraging the country to become more ideologically polarized or just extreme. This part of the class is really neat because it kind of ties into these larger things when we talk about American consumerism and American oligarchy. So to begin this first part of the video where we talk about what are political parties, I simply want to define political party. Political parties consist of politicians, activists, and voters that band together to attempt to win control of government. There are a few examples of political parties in America. Of course, we have the Democratic and Republican Party, but we also have smaller third parties like the Green Party, Libertarian Party, Constitution Party, Peace and Freedom Party, and others, which I'm not going to name here. In all these organizations have the same goal. They're trying to win control of government, and mostly through elections. But further than that, parties solve a broader issue. They solve what's called the collective action problem. Parties are encouraging people to come together with similar political interests, and it's ultimately easier to solve things when you're banding together with a group of people rather than just working on your own. In addition, parties are a pluralist feature of American democracy. And remember, pluralism is an important theme of this class. To review, pluralism is when decisions in government are made by a numerical minority, and parties for sure represent numerical minorities. While most of us are registered with a political party, you shouldn't think of parties as being organizations driven by the mass electorate. Parties, in reality, are controlled by a small number of elites, and these small number of elites are making crucial decisions about the direction and the actions of the parties themselves. But aside from that, parties are crucial. Things wouldn't happen in politics without political parties. For example, could you imagine our two-level system of primaries and the general election for president without political parties? Could we select members of Congress without political parties? Could Congress pass a bill without political parties? Now, you might be kind of on the edge of these questions, but the answer to those questions is no. Parties are a crucial, important part of how government functions. But in considering the role of political parties, you should also ask yourself more critically, are parties an appropriate way to make decisions in American democracy? I've already highlighted for you that elites control parties. So given that elites are controlling parties, do you think that this is an appropriate way for making policy in this country? So moving beyond the definition of political parties, I just want to talk about the origination of the party system really quick. In the Constitution, there is no formal mention of political parties. The framers of the Constitution did contend and realize that there would be some potential for political parties to form, and they really thought that this might be dangerous, in fact. So in the Federalist Papers, the framers wrote Federalist Number 10, and in this paper, they wrote about the danger of factions. And factions are what they saw as political parties. And factions are just groups of people who come together with a purpose. And they, in Federalist 10, described how factions littered England's violent past. And the framers thought that the common good should take precedence over the desires and wants of the factions. Now, the framers didn't really know what our party system would look like, and it's really developed over the course of American history. But in the start of the country, politicians made early steps towards political parties. Remember this conversation between Federalists and Anti-Federalists? They formed our first political parties in this country. And just moreover, the Constitution establishes a process in which the legislature, Congress, passes laws by majority. Since majorities need to be organized, the need for political parties is natural. In order to pass a bill, you're going to form groups, coalitions, people who agree with one another. And these parties in Congress are able to coordinate action so our members can actually pass bills. Thus, at the most basic level, even though the Constitution says nothing explicitly about a political party, our Constitution really does support the creation of political parties. Next, let's talk about what parties actually do. So parties accomplish quite a bit in terms of activity. First, they organize membership. So they organize members to coordinate action. The best way that you can think about this is getting people to vote for candidates. But also, a political party organizes membership to do things like raise money, or go to a rally, or even provide services. So the organization aspect of parties is a huge aspect of parties. Second, parties hold government accountable. Parties are somewhat of a check on government, especially if your party isn't the party in power, because parties attempt to influence government based on the interests of that group, and if your group doesn't hold power, then you're going to hold the party in power in check. Third, parties coordinate laws or policy, right? To pass legislation in the House or Senate, you need a majority. And in order to do this efficiently, legislative leaders organize a consistent group of politicians who are going to meld policy or law for them. And these allegiances even extend beyond Congress. They extend to the state and local levels. So this coordination is tremendous in terms of getting laws passed that this party agrees on. Fourth, parties educate the public. So we talked about the importance of political knowledge, but parties provide information to its membership. It tells its members which issues are important, which candidates they need to support. And people use parties as a shortcut all the time. They might not know too much about an issue, but they might know what this political party says about this particular issue and will follow that idea. Parties also synthesize interests, meaning that parties organize our ideas about politics for us. Organizing your ideas about politics is a huge cognitive task that requires a lot of information and a lot of time. So the synthesis of information is actually fairly important. If you read a party platform, that is basically synthesizing a bunch of different issues across a time span that makes it easy for voters to agree on one set of unified positions. Parties also recruit and develop talent in politicians, right? They ask people to run for office. It takes time to cultivate personalities and characters who are appropriate for office. And a lot of times these people might not even run for politics on their own. As we learned in the elections lecture, parties are responsible for nominating candidates for office. We learned about this in presidential elections mostly, but parties will also nominate candidates in other offices at other levels. And finally, parties are responsible for mobilizing voters to participate. Go vote. That's the main message of most of these parties. So that's the most basic way you can think of organizing the membership, is to get them to vote. But a good reason why turnout is as high as it is in the United States is because parties coordinate the action of its membership. All right, apart from that, parties also kind of exist in different areas just outside of government, right? We can think of parties as existing in government, maybe as members of Congress identifying as Democrats and Republicans, and then members of Congress using that identification for establishing leadership, giving out committee posts. So that's one very specific way to think of political parties, right? The committee structure and leadership in Congress is based on partisan alignment. But from other branches of government, the executive and judiciary even, officials, elected officials, judges, they're all kind of working on the basis of partisan identification. We don't necessarily require politicians to have a party ID, but in practice and in terms of how they come to their individual positions, it's really been on the basis of the work that the party has done. Next, I want to talk about party in the electorate. And party of the electorate really refers to the presence of party in the citizenry at large. Basically, it's how the electorate identifies as being either Republican or Democrat. So 90% of people who are registered use these terms to decide who to vote for. People have a natural strong attachment to political parties, and when they're registering to vote, they're indicating that preference. So whenever we refer to how many Democrats or how many Republicans there are in the United States, we're referring to party in the electorate. This is a very different idea than how I began party in government, which is basically referring to party organization in Congress. Last, I want to talk about party in organization. So party in organization refers to all the volunteers, politicians, the fundraisers, the machine, staff who are understood to be part of the political party. There are major organizations in Washington, D.C., huge buildings which house the Democratic National Committee and the Republican National Committee. Now, these buildings are where the operations of the party take place nationally. But even from state to state, both the Democratic National Committee and the Republican National Committee will have offices. So here's a distinct vision of party which is different than the electorate or government, in which party is moving towards organizing things like polling, fundraising, media outreach, voter outreach. And the party and organization is responsible for doing a lot of things. It's responsible for developing the party's platform. It's responsible for developing the agenda of the party. And it's basically coordinating the day-to-day activity of the party itself. So hopefully in this part of the video, part one, where we just talk about what are political parties, you kind of understand a little bit better the work that the parties are coming to do. Next, we're going to talk about the two-party system. So hopefully I'll be able to describe Democrats and Republicans to you a little bit more clearly than your past conceptualization of the parties. But it's going to be really useful in terms of describing how politics works and the conventions by which there's only two parties that we're allowed to choose from, really, in most elections. So the reason for this, in the second part of the video, is that the structure of American politics, how we conduct elections, but also the makeup of the country forces this two-party system. at least at one point in people's lives, they contend with the ideas of a third party. A lot of people get tired of being classified as either Democrat or Republican or what these two major parties have to offer. So most Americans at one point will look elsewhere. But in actuality, although third parties do exist in the United States, given the structure of American elections and how things work, third parties aren't really a viable option. So this second part of the video will jump right into this and describing why. So the first thing that I want to talk about is you should think of Americans as existing on an ideological spectrum. And the way that we represent an ideological spectrum is on a line, a horizontal line. And on the left, you see liberals, and on the right, you see conservatives. Now, typically, when we think of liberals and conservatives, even in popular media, we talk about them as being left or right. So that really applies to this ideological spectrum, right? You should think of yourself as having preferences on liberal conservative values. Now, we've talked about this in this class, the very first lecture that we had. We discussed this not as an abstract concept, but we discussed this as having preferences for specific values. Liberals prefer equality over freedom, but they prefer freedom over order. Conservatives, on the other hand, prefer order over freedom, but they prefer freedom over order. So, if you need a review on that, I would go back and watch that video. But more basically, liberals on the left, conservatives on the right, and we tend to think of liberals as being the Democratic Party and conservatives as being the Republican Party. So most Americans have an ideal point on this ideological space, on this line, meaning that you should place yourself somewhere between liberal and conservative. Maybe you're a real true moderate, and if that were the case, you would put yourself on the center of this line between liberal and conservative. If you're a democratic socialist, you would probably be closer to where it says liberal on the far left. And of course, if you're really conservative, far right, you would place yourself to the right of this line. Now, in explaining the two-party system and why we only have two viable options in most elections, one of the things that we should do is we should try to consider how this works across the country. And part of what we want to do is we want to take this ideological space and attempt to put all Americans on the ideological space. So now I'm changing this from just a straight line on the PowerPoint slide to a graph. So on the x-axis, you still have the ideological space from liberal to conservative. But on the y-axis, I'm going to basically do a frequency graph by indicating the number of people in the electorate that identify as liberal or conservative. Now, traditionally, the way that political scientists have thought about this is that for most Americans, the parties don't really represent their true opinions about politics, meaning that there isn't really people in the country who are very far left and very far right. Most Americans are casual observers of politics. We work 40 hours a week, we have families, we have other concerns outside of politics. So if we were trying to place people on this graph to determine how much of the country is liberal and conservative, it'd actually be the case that most of the people in this country would be moderate. So this is actually represented well by a normal curve, right? This curve represents the number of people that we think are liberal and conservative. So at the edges of this ideological space, the curve is at its lowest value, right? There are very few people in the United States who consider themselves to be extremely liberal or extremely conservative. But as you get closer and closer to the center of this graph, you start to see more people identify as moderates. And then ultimately speaking, when we talk about how elections work in this country, one of the things that's important to do is, well, is to consider what are politicians actually trying to achieve in the course of an election. So this graph is perfect because this graph represents the ideal point in terms of ideology of all American voters at one time. And as a candidate, maybe the first thing that you want to do is you want to identify what we call the median voter. So the median voter is one person in America. And there's this one person who finds themselves in the ideological center of this space. And they split the American public in half. So that's represented by this vertical straight line that you see in the center of the PowerPoint slide. So there's an equal number of people to the left of the median voter, to the right of the median voter. And what this median voter represents is the favored point for candidates to follow. Because it's the case, you'll have liberal and conservative candidates, as we did in 2016. As candidates, they're trying to win the optimal number of votes, the more number of votes. And Hillary Clinton was to the left, Donald Trump was to the right. So they understand this somewhat. They understand that there's 300 million people in America, and the way to win this election is by appealing to the median voter. So although Hillary Clinton might be left and Donald Trump might feel right, they ultimately want to move to the ideological center in the course of an election, right? So this is one of the reasons why we only have two choices in an election, is that if we have a liberal candidate, if we have a conservative candidate, they're both going to try to move to the center in order to win the most amount of votes. So the median voter theorem states that candidates will always attempt to appeal to the ideological center. Now you might ask yourself, well, yes, this makes sense. But what if there were multiple parties in our system? What if it wasn't just a choice between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump? Maybe Jill Stein or Gary Johnson, third-party candidates who would find themselves somewhere else on this ideological space. Maybe they would be able to attract more people in a different direction. Well, you can also place more than two candidates on this space. So candidate A, candidate B, candidate C, and candidate D. Now these are now fictional candidates. Two are more liberal, two are more conservative, and even within the liberal and conservative candidates, you have someone who is more moderate and more extreme. Same thing still applies though, right? Just because of the way that people in the electorate are ideologically organized, it's going to be the case in this example with 4 candidates in this election, that this election is really only going to be between candidate B and candidate C. And between candidate B and candidate C, the person who's going to win is going to be the person who moves closer to the ideological middle. This is the median voter theorem, right? And really, candidate A and candidate D, they're also going to be pressured to move closer to the middle, simply because there's a greater number of people in the electorate closer to the ideological middle. And if candidate A and candidate D hold true to their values of being extreme liberals and being extreme conservatives, respectively, they're going to lose this election. So, although you might really think that third parties might represent some interesting ideas, that they might be transforming American politics in certain years, just because of the way that we conduct elections, just because of the way that the electorate is set up ideologically, third parties are really systematically disadvantaged. The other way to think of this perhaps might be in a congressional election. So if we're voting for a member to represent us in the House of Representatives in Norma Torres's district, right? The way that Norma Torres' election works is that she's running for one seat, and this one seat represents areas of Pomona, Ontario, Chino, etc. We're only going to elect one person in this election, and Norma Torres has to win by a plurality, which just means that she has to win more votes than anyone else. So you could even view Norma Torres' election on this graph of candidate A, B, C, and D. It really benefits Norma Torres to be in the ideological middle. So even if there were a bunch of different candidates in this race for the House, because of the fact that there's only one winner and the person who wins the most votes wins the election, they're going to be more and more pressured to move to the ideological middle in order to win the plurality. So this is a little abstract, right? I'm using hypotheticals mostly, and I'm talking about what voters prefer in a very abstract kind of way. But nonetheless, it kind of outlays a logic about how political science views the reputations of third parties. Now, in the next section, where I move on to part 3 and talk about polarization, I'm still going to talk about third parties a little bit, but you'll even begin to see how third parties are probably not a really good representation for our American electoral system. They're not a good choice. But the third part of the video will also talk about polarization, and this idea maybe that the parties themselves, Democrats and Republicans, are becoming more and more different from one another in the last 20 or 30 years. So in part 3 of the video, where we talk about polarization, formally defined is this idea that the two parties are becoming more ideologically extreme. What this means in practice is that the Republican Party is moving further to the right. They're becoming more conservative over time. And the Democratic Party is similar. They're moving further to the left. They're becoming more liberal over time. And this is really on all sets of issues. Now, maybe informally, you probably have recognized that polarization has become a problem, right? And this is part of this question about what choice do voters have in an election if we're choosing between the Democratic and Republican Party. In reality, maybe these parties don't offer sensible choice in terms of what most Americans believe about politics. Now, this conversation about polarization is really important because it really highlights a lot of issues and problems with American politics. It's a story about politics, about conflict, and how folks relate to one another in trying to figure out matters of law in government. And it's not about just parties per se, it's also about media, right? It's a story about how media profits off of polarization. It's also a story about politicians who are rewarded when they go negative and are rewarded when they toe the party line. And there's a lot of evidence in how polarization is occurring. So political science has done a really good job at finding data that suggests that the ideological extremeness is occurring more and more in the last couple decades. So when we talk about polarization in government, we know that votes in Congress are becoming more party line. This means that members of Congress are voting more and more with their party and not deviating from the party line on even the most basic of votes. We also know that polarization is occurring in the electorate, where when people vote for president, Senate, House, state, and local levels, they also tend to vote party line. That people are voting more and more according to their partisan identification, and they won't take a second to consider the candidate from the other party because of more ideological extremism. And finally, we know that parties are also becoming more polarized in the organization. And the way that we know and look at that is through the party platforms. Remember that Republicans and Democrats issue their platforms at the convention every 4 years, and these platforms talk about social issues, racial issues, cultural issues, and we've looked at the content of these platforms from the 1970s to today, and we have found that these platforms are becoming more ideologically extreme. So in this last section of the class, I just covered, there's different ways that we think about party, government, electorate, organization, but in practice, in the last couple decades, parties are becoming further and further apart. And this is not good for American government. So this part of the class where we talk about polarization, we really want to talk about the origination of polarization, why this has really happened. And if we really want to talk about polarization, we have to have a discussion about wedge issues. Wedge issues is something that really takes off in the 1990s. There's been popular work. Political scientists have written books that talk about culture wars. And the real culture war began in 1994 when Republicans tried to take over the House of Representatives with what they call the contract with America. So to set the stage, Bill Clinton is president in 1994, and before Bill Clinton, Republicans had held the presidency for 12 years, but Democrats had long-standing control of Congress in the first 2 years of the Clinton administration. Democrats controlled the Senate for a period of 10 years before, and the House for nearly 4 decades. So in 1994, Republicans came up with what was called the Contract with America. They unified their strategy and basically decided to take back all of these congressional offices. Now, this was done exceptionally well in the House of Representatives because the Republicans, who were then led by Minority Leader Newt Gingrich, ran for Congress on the argument that they would keep a promise to America. And this contract to America is that they would limit government, but focus on legislative proposals that at least had the support of 60% of the American public. That sounds fantastic, right? I mean, let's focus on issues that only a majority of Americans support. But in their strategy, they chose issues that were meant to be divisive. They chose issues which we now call wedge issues. So what's a wedge issue? A wedge issue is an extraordinarily controversial issue. It's meant to introduce extraordinary discomfort in Democrats by forcing them to defend policies, especially on social issues that most Americans, at least at the time, they opposed. Another word for wedge issues is that these are issues that are meant to troll people. And these wedge issues are not really representative of the platforms. They're not really representative of the major concerns of most Americans, and it's just mostly focused on social conservatism. So the contract with America sounds on its face as legitimate. We're only going to talk about issues that 60% of Americans support, but the social contract of America is putting social conservatism at the forefront of American politics. So what are some examples of these wedge issues? Well, one of the major ones that they chose in 1994 was same-sex marriage. Now, by no means in the 1990s were Democrats hoping to legalize same-sex marriage. In fact, Clinton's don't ask, don't tell policy in the military was seen as kind of like a Democratic misstep. Bill Clinton actually ran on this idea that LGBT members would be able to serve openly in the military. So Bill Clinton introduced Don't Ask, Don't Tell as kind of a moderating position. But at the time, this was seen as kind of like a slippery slope because Bill Clinton indicated support for ending the ban against gay servicemen. Many Republicans thought that Democrats, for the next step, would want to legalize same-sex marriage. Another example of a wedge issue at the time was abortion, still is. Now, President Clinton's opinion on abortion was that it should be legal, but that it also should be pretty rare. In fact, this is how most Americans thought and still think about abortion, that it should be allowed, but only under rare circumstances. Now, this is still a central issue for Republicans, and this plays out significantly in the 1990s. But for this election, Republicans really centered on what's called partial birth abortion. And they took the stance of trying to ban partial birth abortion. At the time, partial birth abortion only occurred in 0.2% of all abortions performed in the country, although we don't have very good information about why they were performed. These late-term abortions forced Democrats to articulate their positions on abortion at its most extreme. And this was able to paint Democrats into a corner because they were unwilling to disavow themselves from supporting partial birth abortion. There's other examples of wedge issues: flag burning, this idea that Democrats don't protect free speech, undocumented immigrants. But regardless of which wedge issues the Republicans chose, this process of bringing social conservatism, these controversial issues to the forefront, cemented the presence of a lot of social conservatives in national politics. and even working class people who saw themselves as socially conservative. It firmly brought them to the Republican Party. And this was remarkably effective. For the first time in 1994, Republicans had won the House of Representatives, going all the way back from 1952. They would actually hold on to the House of Representatives until 2008, when Barack Obama would win the presidency. And this also signifies a time when Republicans, subsequent to 1994, began winning statewide offices at an accelerated rate. Republicans continue focusing on wedge issues, winning support across the country for the next 15 years on the basis of things like same-sex marriage, abortion, immigration, and flag burning. To a certain extent, focusing on wedge issues is somewhat challenging and has backfired with Republicans, at least on LGBT rights, because society and both Democrats and Republicans have progressed on LGBT rights. The idea is that now most Americans know an openly gay person in their family or as their friends. And for younger generations, it is more common for young people to be progressive on LGBT rights, mostly because you've probably known a gay person since you were in grade school. And this is not the case for most older Americans. So why is this conversation important? Why am I focusing on this at the end of this lecture? Well, this is even true in the contemporary time, right? Donald Trump loves to use wedge issues. A couple of months ago, he talked about the caravan coming to the United States. A caravan of immigrants who were going to cross the border, 5,000 strong, who would rush the border. Now, immigration is something we should definitely talk about. It's an important element of the economy, of our culture, of the future of our country. But the caravan and the way that Donald Trump discussed it was definitely a wedge issue. It forced people to take a position on a relatively extreme instance of an immigration problem. Now, it's been months since Donald Trump talked about the caravan before the 2008 midterms. We really weren't met with this emergency that Donald Trump claimed. And at the same time, if you think about this more practically, Border Patrol has regularly processed up to 60,000 people at the southwest border per month. On an average day across the United States, more than 500,000 people come into the country by land. So by talking about the caravan, it's a strategy for Trump to basically force people to take a position on immigration. The images of people rushing the border trying to seek asylum are scary to most Americans. And there's great examples of this in the past. In the mid-1990s, California passed Proposition 187, and Proposition 187 banned immigrants from using, undocumented immigrants from using social services. Now, this was a Republican proposition, but it was a probable reason for kind of the decline of the Republican Party in the last 20 years. They used Proposition 187 as a wedge issue, right? It's going to backfire if the Republican Party uses images like the caravan in trying to force people to think a certain way about immigration. So what's the bigger picture, right? Is this kind of discussion about politics by focusing on wedge issues, is this helpful? Is it making citizens more informed about politics? Absolutely not, right? At least in the very limited way that we discuss politics by forcing people to pick a side on a wedge issue, this makes citizens hate politics. We're not talking about real substantive issues here. It's mostly about cultural divides that don't really affect most Americans on a day-to-day basis. Okay, let's kind of switch gears, because talking about wedge issues is quite a bit. Let's talk about maybe third parties, because that's also a good conversation to have in this discussion about polarization, right? Given that two-party control of American politics is somewhat of a fact, given that polarization is getting worse, then maybe we should seek alternatives, right? Third parties might be a good alternative. And like I said in the prior sections of this video, some people at one point in their lives are going to consider this third-party alternative. And this happens really commonly in college, actually. For many college students, the Libertarian Party seems like an attractive alternative. In the past 40 years, libertarianism has been popular with college students. But let's talk about why, right? So as a valid third-party strategy, let's deconstruct this a little bit. So what does a Libertarian Party stand for? Well, one of the central tenets of the Libertarian Party is about freedom. We learned about this, right, in that very first video of the class. They like freedom over order, and they like freedom over equality. Libertarians just want little government intervention. They don't want government to intervene in their everyday lives. Libertarians believe that people should be allowed to do whatever they want, in so much as what they do is not hurting others. Now, many of what libertarians kind of base their principles on lie in what we call the free market. And the free market's an idea that citizens can basically enter to transactional relationships with each other without interference from a broader government entity. And to many people, this sounds good, especially in light of the fact that our government is run by two parties who are, by all accounts, gross and remarkably inefficient. And I want to outline some elements of the Libertarian platform, which you can find on their website, actually. So there's a Libertarian website, and they talk about what they represent. But Libertarians call for things like the repeal of the income tax. That sounds great. They want to abolish the IRS. Also sounds great. They don't want employers to collect taxes. But apart from that, which a lot of people probably can get on board with, they think that the free market's going to regulate our environment, basically forcing or encouraging corporations to police themselves on environmental issues. They think that parents should choose the best school for their children, and schools should be run on a free market. They think that we should, yes, buy healthcare on a free market as well. On foreign policy, they think it's important that we have a military to defend ourselves from outside aggression, and that we need adequate intelligence to defend ourselves from domestic threats even. But we should think twice maybe about providing for a police force or other types of protection that's not given on the free market. On the platform, there's nothing about infrastructure. How do we pay for roads, signs, or the maintenance of existing public institutions like schools or community centers or parks? What about the welfare of citizens? There's nothing on that website that says protecting your civil liberties, your civil rights, because everything is based on personal responsibility. So while the limited government intervention might sound somewhat good, there's elements of the Libertarian platform that are pretty unrealistic, especially because since they're relying on the free market, there's some sort of expectation that corporations are somehow going to be shaped by public action. Maybe, right? And we talked about this with Story of Stuff. If people don't give into their materialistic consumerism behavior, perhaps libertarianism would work. But in an era of climate change where we really need quick collective action and the potential for events like mass weather disasters, droughts, starvation, diseases, I wouldn't want to rely on the free market. We need government, right? Because in a time where climate change is real and disasters are on the verge of happening, consumer behavior is not a substitute for government processes, especially if we care about protecting minorities. And I'm talking about numerical minorities. I'm not talking about ethnic or racial minorities. There are people in government or people in society who are going to be ignored if we're relying on the free market. But, I'm spending a lot of time talking about this third party because I think it's important. I think a lot of college students focus on libertarianism as a viable alternative, especially when they get turned off from the Democratic Republican politics that we see so much of. But even if I'm being less theoretical, there's more reason to be skeptical of modern day libertarianism. And one of the things that you'll see if you go back to the early history of libertarians is that you see some pretty interesting people involved in the Libertarian Party. Now I'm going to talk now about elites. And the elites that I'm going to discuss are the Koch brothers. I hope at some point before this class you've heard of the Koch brothers, because the Koch brothers are basically the personification of the American oligarchy. They are basically the elites who I'm talking so much about in this class, but I haven't really given you good examples yet. The Koch brothers are actually today known as more conservative. They are Republicans, and they're consistent donors to the Republican Party, but they are extremely influential in government. They are extremely influential in the corporate world, and they've donated billions of dollars to influence what we do on a day-to-day basis. So let's talk about who they are, because they're important to libertarianism, but they're also important to the broader themes of this class about oligarchy and also consumerism. So the Koch brothers are Charles and David Koch, and they were actually born in Wichita, Kansas. They have a $95 billion fortune, and they're some of the richest people in the world. They own the second largest private company in America, and what they do with this company is mostly oil, gas, and fossil fuel production. Corporatism, right? This is one of the things that we talk about, story of stuff. Now, if you ask the Koch brothers themselves, they think of themselves as being self-made men, but they've inherited over $680 million of their own net worth. They also went to MIT, which is an excellent institution. It's also an elite institution. And at MIT, they were engineers. So a lot of you are engineers, which is a good example maybe of why you should pay attention to politics. But when people look at the Koch brothers' past, they have discussed how they've looked at taking over American politics as kind of an engineering challenge, figuring out how American politics works, what are the pressure points, and kind of creating an assembly line of basically influencing people to do what they want. And they've spent the last 40 years to try to figure out how to manipulate the American public with their money. And over the last 40 years, they have literally spent billions of dollars. It's disgusting. And without much attention or scrutiny, and most Americans probably don't even know who they are. So what do they do in trying to influence public opinion? Well, they contribute money, right? They contribute to campaigns as citizens, but they also create interest groups. And these interest groups we'll talk about in the next unit, but they're also called super PACs. In America in general, there's an abundance of rich people donating to campaigns and corporations for sure. But a lot of this is the Koch brothers themselves. They're doing a lot of this activity. And the Koch brothers in the 1970s decide that the only way to capture American politics was to change the way that Americans think about politics. Now, in the 1970s, most Americans were pretty optimistic about politics. They trusted government. Now, a lot of things happened in the 1970s, Vietnam, Watergate, but the Koch brothers kind of jumped at the chance to institute their thoughts into the American public, and they really believed that we should have no government at all. And they still believe that to this day. Now, the Kochs were libertarians before they were Republicans. And in 1980, David Koch ran as the vice presidential candidate on the Libertarian ballot. And the platform on that election in 1980 was incredibly telling for what the Koch brothers believe. Quote, "We urge the repeal of federal campaign finance laws." I mean, this is a precursor, right, to Citizens United versus FEC. Quote, "We favor the abolition of Medicare and Medicaid. We favor the deregulation of medical insurance. We support the eventual repeal of all taxation. We support the abolition of the Environmental Protection Agency." And a lot of these platforms, these statements have been adopted by today's Republican Party. And this is no coincidence because the Koch brothers are extremely influential in the Republican Party. So after David Koch runs for president in 1980, they decided that this is not the way to go, right? Third parties don't work in America. And they decided that they're going to change public opinion. And you don't do that just by electing candidates. So beginning in the 1980s, after this election, the Koch brothers try to change American public opinion by doing things like funding what we call think tanks. And you've probably heard the phrase think tanks before, but these are basically research organizations, and I use that term really loosely, organizations doing research, putting out reports that are based on bunk science that advocate the Koch brothers' positions. There's a long list of these, and you maybe heard of them: the Cato Institute, the Federal Society, the Heritage Foundation, Americans for Prosperity. All of these are just basically Koch-funded research organizations. They're also buying into universities now. They spent over $23 million in colleges and universities in just 1 year alone. Over the country, there's 350 programs that are funded by the Kochs. And two of the biggest are George Mason University and Florida State University. So the Kochs have a deal with those two institutions to disclose personal information about students, but also to have their teachings aligned with the libertarian philosophy of the Kochs. And they also have faculty approval at George Mason and Florida State, which is insane. They've also aimed at getting young people involved in the cause. They understand that this is a generational shift that they're trying to change. So it's not just about electing candidates and donating money. It's about changing thought in America. And what they really want to change, and so I'm talking about this extensively, right? They're trying to change public opinion. They're trying to change the way that we think. So what is it, Guerrero, that they're trying to do? Well, the message that they're trying to send out is they want Americans to hate government, right? They think that government shouldn't exist. And if you really think about this, it's scary because it's almost worked. Really, really well, it's probably worked. Now, let's maybe deconstruct this a little bit more. These think tanks that I just talked about. All a think tank is, again, is an organization that puts out, quote, research reports. But these reports have been reported out in Congress. The Kochs have funded studies that have said things like the more guns that you'll have, the safer you will be, that crime will go down. Social scientists have long proven that's untrue. They've also issued reports, and gun control is a harder issue. There's a lot of people who are staunch supporters of Second Amendment rights, and granted, there's good reason to have guns based on the Second Amendment, but that's a whole other conversation. Let's talk about climate change, because most people do agree that climate change is happening, that it's not man-made, that it's cyclical. Now, remember that Koch Industries, this company that they own, the second largest private company in America, is a fossil fuel business. It's in the oil and gas business. They have a large incentive to fuel skepticism about climate change. This skepticism that people don't think that climate change is real comes from these think tanks. It comes from funding false debates. We're the only country in the developed world where the consensus is moving away from we have something to do. We need to do something about climate change. And how far have the Koch brothers' reach really extended beyond just changing public opinion? Well, it is getting into our public officials. The New Yorker published a piece last year that tied the Koch brothers to our vice president, Mike Pence. During the 2016 presidential primaries, Donald Trump spoke out against the Kochs. He said that any of his Republican rivals who attended the secret summits sponsored by the Koch brothers were their puppets. The Koch brothers raised $900 million to spend on the 2016 elections. But Koch, Charles Koch, described the choice between Trump and Hillary as a choice between, quote, a cancer and a heart attack. But eventually they decided with the Republican Party because the Koch brothers have had a hold on Mike Pence for years. Since 2008, Mike Pence has been working with the Kochs through the way of Mark Short, who was Mike Pence's chief of staff, but is now the White House legislative director. Mike Pence went to these secret donor summits. He's basically taken donations from the Kochs ever since he was a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. And Trump chose Mike Pence to be his running mate because Pence had close ties to Christian conservatives and was an asset to win Midwest voters. Trump put Pence in charge of the transition into office, but Trump didn't really say anything when Mike Pence started appointing a large number of officials with ties to the Koch brothers. The head of the Environmental Protection Agency, which I mentioned that the Koch brothers wanted to get rid of, is Scott Pruitt. Scott Pruitt is heavily supported by the Koch brothers. Our Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, she's a member of the Koch brothers donor network, super rich. The head of the CIA, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, was a congressman in Wichita, in the district the Koch brothers lived in, supported by Koch money since he was a congressman. So it's not coincidental that the head of the APA, Secretary of Education, Secretary of State are all Koch operatives. This almost begins to sound conspiracy level theory-ish, right? And this is an academic class on American government. But, we're starting to get into talking about interest groups. We're going to talk about media in a sec. I introduced the idea of oligarchy and corporatism and consumerism really early on. But hopefully with this lecture, Unit 10, you start to see this really coming to fruition. All of this stuff is out there for public consumption. We know that this stuff to be true. Yet most Americans don't think twice about the power of elites. Now, one of the things that we'll eventually talk about is what we can do as American everyday average citizens facing this kind of influence. But in terms of political parties, right, when we talk about third parties, libertarians, it looks like libertarians don't really offer us a good choice, right? And even though limited government intervention might sound good in light of the fact that the two parties are polarized, the major element in all of this is that people are just not really plugged in anymore, right? People are just way too indifferent. People, like we were talking about in the public opinion section, are just unknowledgeable. And maybe this is one of the ways to fix this. So I've introduced a lot in this last part of the class where I've talked about polarization. I think this part of the class is really good for the paper, by the way. So if you're trying to kind of generate ideas about the paper and really trying to sink your teeth into it, the duration of this third part of the class will hopefully give you some good things to talk about. But other than that, moving forward, I've also opened up a couple of lines of inquiry, which I'll begin to address and finish up in the last couple units of the course.